Denzaguru Pema CD Hung Nga Hung Denzaguru Pema CD Hung Nga Hung Denzaguru Pema CD Hung. Okay, thank you for attending my Dharma talk. It's Tuesday at 4 p.m. Second Life time here at the Chitta Bhavana Ashram. Today's talk is entitled, Was the Buddha a Shaman? And in this talk I'll be discussing the question, was the Buddha a shaman? To address this question, I will begin by explaining what shamanism is. I will then discuss why we might ask this question of the Buddha. That is to say, how is this question relevant to Buddhism? I will then proceed to a discussion of Soma. Soma was the forgotten ecstatic plant medicine that was the central object of the Aryan Vedic cult that became the determining cultural influence of India after 1500 before the Common Era. Thus, by definition, it influenced Buddhism too. Next, I will compare the elements of the Buddha's life and teachings to those of the classic archetype of the shaman. And finally, I'll conclude with a discussion of the use of psychedelics in Buddhism. Please note that the question here is, was the Buddha a shaman, not did the Buddha or his entourage use or advocate the use of psychedelics. This talk was actually featured in a somewhat antagonistic discussion in Reddit a while back. However, the person who posted the original message concerning the talk misinterpreted my talk and was interpreting my talk to mean that I was claiming that the Buddha himself took or advocated the taking of psychedelics, and I am making no such claim, and I just would like to underline that. The latter is a much more complex question than the former. Nonetheless, the close association of shamanism and psychedelics is well established, and for that reason I will be discussing it in the context, to provide context for the actual question of this talk, which is, was the Buddha a shaman? The word shaman is derived from the Tungus word saman. It is etymologically related to the Sanskrit and Pali words for an Indian ascetic of the 5th and 6th centuries before the Common Era, a shamana or samana. The word derives from shram, meaning to heat. Shamanism is especially associated with the northern steppes, close to the reputed origin of the Aryans, the creators of the Vedas and the initiators of the Vedic cultural complex that the Buddha inherited. This view of the Aryan migration theory is also somewhat controversial, but I think it's a moderate interpretation of this theory is still the mainstream academic view, so that's the view that I'll be taking in this talk. Shamanic ideological motifs and ecstatic techniques have also been identified in Asia, Africa, and America. This has led to the hypothesis that shamanism is the original prehistoric proto-religion of humanity, and this view is now very widely held. The essential task of a shaman is the cultivation of the ecstatic trance journey. Through this journey, he experiences contact with intelligent entities. These entities take various forms. Some provide him with spiritual teachings, prophecies, and information. These include cures for the maladies of the people, including the experience of ecstasy itself. Thus, the shaman is the archetypal wounded healer. He becomes sick and then is healed by the same medicine that he offers to others. These entities are often described as spirits. The 19th century view that shamans are mentally ill has been discredited, but it is still unfortunately widespread. Eliade has shown that shamans are the psychologically healthiest and most intelligent members of the community. They are tricksters, to be sure, but not in the vulgar sense of fakes, although, of course, there are fake shamans, too. Unfortunately, in the popular consciousness, I think the association of shamanism with mental illness on the one hand and charlatanism on the other is still quite widespread. However, it can really not, that view is really no longer sustainable. This ecstatic trance state of the shaman may be induced in many ways, and I've appended a list of 35 techniques to this talk. I codified these examples of technical methodologies for the induction of altered states of consciousness, or ASCs, because of my study of shamanism during the 1990s. You can find that list of techniques that I've identified as the essential techniques of shamanism in an appendix to this talk, which is located on my blog at www.polysodas.com. If you're interested in taking a look at it, you'll find, not surprisingly, the techniques identified are the widespread in pretty much all religions, especially religions which cultivate the experiential side of spirituality as opposed to the dogmatic side. However, preeminently psychedelics have been used to induce this state, including ayahuasca, yage, iboga or ibogaine, soma, cannabis, etc. Although illegal in our so-called democratic Western countries, it is still possible to experience these plant medicines in their native cultural context in a few countries in the world, notably in Peru. Not only Peru, some African countries as well. Graham Hancock mentions an experience he had with ibogaine in Africa. Pardon me, I don't think it was in Africa, but it's from Africa. But ibogaine is still a living spiritual tradition in Africa, which is my point. These sacred plant medicines seem to enable the user to access higher dimensions of consciousness and other ontic levels of existence. Theorists such as Aldous Huxley, Terence McKenna, Graham Hancock, and others theorize that the discovery of psychedelics by pre-hominids led to the rapid evolution of the human neocortex, the so-called stoned ape hypothesis, which is a neat explanation for the appearance of human consciousness. And in view of the physiology of the human brain, which has numerous receptors built into the synaptic structures of the brain, which specifically are designed to accept and respond to psychedelics, it does seem like a very plausible hypothesis. The brain also produces its own psychedelic, dimethyltryptamine, in the pineal gland in tiny quantities. And this substance is found in nature in plants, especially mushrooms. So that's a pretty interesting coincidence as well. During the rest of this talk, I'll explore the similarities between shamanism and Samanism, known to antiquity as the Samaneans, also known as the Gymnosophists. In the European tradition, these people were known to the Europeans from a fairly early date, followed by a discussion of the Soma cult of the Aryans and its influence on late Vedic culture. Finally, we'll compare the life and teachings of the Buddha to the archetypal pattern of the shaman, and I'll conclude with an overview of the use of entheogens by Buddhists. You may also experience a bit of repetition in this talk, since I do recur to similar themes from different angles in order to make my various points and build up a comprehensive picture. So let's start with Samanism. When the Buddha abandoned his father, his wife, his child, his home, and his inheritance at the age of 29, according to most modern scholars, somewhere about 450 before the Common Era, he gave away his horse, stripped off his clothing, shaved his head, and adopted the brownish-orange robe of an Indian samana, probably scavenged from a charnel ground, as was the custom. You will, of course, recognize in this robe the robe of the Buddhist monk, which is where it came from. It actually came from Samanism. Samanism was a non-Vedic, anti-Brahmanic Indian religious counterculture that was already well established by the 5th century before the Common Era. It originated in the 6th century and before. The Upanishads, the oldest of which appeared between 1200 and 800 before the Common Era, influenced the Samanas, I should say. The most recent Upanishads were written during the last several centuries before the Common Era. So the most recent Upanishads actually post-date the death of or parinibbana of the Buddha, and actually Buddhism did influence some of the late Upanishads as well. Like the Upanishads, the Samanas cast their minds back to a cosmic spiritual philosophy coterminous with the origin of Indian civilization, hidden within either the Vedas or even pre-Vedic. The Samanas gave rise to yoga, Jainism, Buddhism, and the notions of samsara and moksha, but most of all to the Proto-Shaivites, worshippers of Shiva. The practices of the Shaivites bear many resemblances to the Samanas. The Sanskrit word shramana, the origin of the Pali word, is derived from the root shram. This word has numerous meanings and connotations, including to heat, roast, cook, ripen, mature, seethe, boil, conquer, subdue, overcome, make effort, exert oneself, labor, bake, sweat, rush, hurry. Similarly, the Pali word for austerity, tapas, also means heat. The Pali Canon contains detailed descriptions of the kinds of practices that the Samanas, including the Buddha prior to his enlightenment, engaged in, including living and sleeping in charnel grounds or in forests, torturing the body, self-starvation, cross-legged meditation, regulating the breathing, and various mental exercises designed to develop the will and detachment from pain and desire in the pursuit of spiritual emancipation or moksha. The Buddha took self-mortification, including eating his own excrement and subjecting the body to extremes of hot and cold, to the point of dying. The Buddha engaged in these practices prior to his enlightenment and attained a Kundalini-type illumination accompanied by severe physical pain. He also mastered the meditations corresponding to the spheres of nothingness and neither perception nor non-perception, the top two planes of samsara. Although, after his enlightenment at the age of 35, around 450 BCE, the Buddha rejected the extreme aspects of the Samana cult, hence the name of Majjhima Patipada, or middle way, for his teaching. Many Samana practices nonetheless remained part of the Buddha's teaching, including retiring to charnel grounds, meditating on death, poverty, chastity, and the practice of yoga. The Samanas exhibit many similarities with the later Shaivite cult, as I have discussed in previous talks. The origin of Shaivism is generally assigned to the Svetashvata Upanishad, which was written between 400 and 200 before the Common Era, so just somewhat shortly, possibly very shortly actually, after the death of the Buddha, or perhaps a little later. The Shaivites worshipped Shiva. Shiva was famed for consuming datura, cannabis, psilocybin, and in this talk I'll use the word psilocybin to include psilocin, to which psilocybin is converted in the body, and strychnine, as well as soma. The Samanas also sat cross-legged, meditated, and practiced many austerities. How extensive experimentation with plant medicines might have been amongst the Samanas, and therefore how likely it is that the Buddha himself might have been exposed to it, is unknown to me. Buddhism certainly incorporated Shiva himself in at least 10 forms, including Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, who holds a flask of Amrita, and Mahakala, a fearsome Buddhist protector, amongst others. The word samana is also the etymological origin of the English word shaman. The word shaman originates from the Tunguski-Evenki language of North Asia, but has been applied to a wide-ranging system of spiritual beliefs and practices that have been identified in Asia, Africa, Australasia, and the Americas. Many scholars believe that shamanism represents the Paleolithic proto-religion of humanity from 2.6 million years ago to about 10,000 years ago. And in fact, I would say this is now, at least amongst progressive scholars, this would be the mainstream view. Although it's still possible to find books and articles by more mainstream scholars, especially Indian scholars, who discuss soma without any reference to psychedelics. I actually recently read a book by a scholar like this. He managed to write an entire book on soma and never acknowledge its origin in psychedelics. The prehistoric cave paintings of France and Spain, which date from about 30,000 to 40,000 years ago, are highly consistent with modern representations of presumed spiritual, mystical, or ecstatic states. These include the cross-legged shaman of the Indus Valley civilization known as Pashupati, the lord of the animals, the Celtic Chrononos, the pictographs of Petroglyphs Park, located in Ontario, Canada, and modern ayahuasca visions. I've chosen phenomena quite diverse in place and time in order to demonstrate that such phenomena, widely diverse in time and space, exhibits such similarities, and this is striking evidence of an underlying commonality. So let's go on to talk about Soma. The Aryans are supposed to have progressively merged with and displaced the native Dravidian population over a period of several centuries, about 1500 before the Common Era. They are reputed to have emigrated from the northern steppes. They also practiced shamanism in conjunction with the imbibition of the psychedelic Soma drink, especially the rishis, the Vedic seers, to which the origin of the Vedic hymns are attributed. 1000 before the Common Era is the threshold to the late Vedic period. For a reason that has yet to be satisfactorily explained, but may be related to migration or weather changes, the recipe for Soma was lost, and the ritual cult of Brahmanism developed a more rigid and authoritarian religious and social structure, including the caste system and the oppression of women, something I've discussed in another talk called Status of Women in Ancient India and the Pali Tradition. This period was also a period characterized by a great mythological war between two groups of divinities, the Devas, or Shining Ones, and the Asuras, literally lords, but interpreted based on an etymology which means anti-gods, a false etymology as it happens, but nonetheless it was historically influential. The Asuras seem to be associated with vast cosmic and natural powers, older and more powerful than the Devas. The explanation for why the Devas were able to overcome them and cast them down from the plane of the 33 gods is that they were drunk on Amrita, suggesting a connection between the downfall of the Asuras and the forgetting of Soma, perhaps. The Asuras were cast down into the cosmic ocean, where, together with the Devas, they churned the cosmic ocean for Soma. And it's quite interesting that even though they were cast down, from the myth, it seems that the Asuras are a necessary part of the process of producing Soma, because they continued to cooperate with the Devas in order to generate this sacrament, really. We find a similar story in the Pali Canon, not about the churning, but about the cooperation, where both the Devas and the Asuras actually come to listen to and pay homage to the Buddha. This mythos reminds me of the lotus that digs its roots deep into the slime, an image which also appears frequently in Buddhism, including the Pali Canon. It is interesting that the Asuras, who are now essentially demonic in nature, are necessary for the production of Soma, as I just said. The Brahmins, no longer able to experience the original Soma, substitute a relatively innocuous surrogate made from a non-psychoactive vine or concoction made from herbs, grain, and saffron. The ritual replaced the reality, as happens so often in the history of religions, a point that the Buddha makes frequently. Thus, Vedic India is an example of a culture that is explicitly based on the cultivation of the psychedelic experience. It is a prime argument for the stoned ape hypothesis that psychedelics are responsible for the rapid evolution of the human neocortex and, indeed, human civilization itself. Especially experiential religion, or yoga, if you want to use that term, as a placebo for the consumption of psychedelics. And you'll notice all the techniques given, all the meditation techniques and the sleep deprivation and the fasting and the seclusion, the sensory deprivation, etc., that one finds described in the Pali Canon and other Buddhist literature, these are all techniques which are clearly intended to induce the psychedelic type experience without the actual consumption of psychedelics necessarily, although the combination of those techniques with those psychedelics is also very effective in the induction of the altered state of consciousness or the ecstatic state. So the placebo idea certainly that point is well taken. and it is relevant, but I wouldn't say that soma itself was a placebo. I think that's an oversimplification. Paloma Porta says yes, but that assumes the brain exists when it all is just consciousness. Consciousness is the law driving the bus. Well, I think we can say the brain exists and consciousness is the fundamental thing simultaneously. And yes, I think I've addressed that. Consciousness is in and of itself capable, with significant effort, of inducing the ecstatic state. So psychedelics aren't necessary to do that, and I'm certainly not implying that they are. Nonetheless, they were widely used in ancient times before we discovered democracy and outlawed everything that disagreed with the prevailing ideology of our society. And I'm being ironic there, of course. Okay, so the Vedas themselves are the articulate expression of soma. Professor Iravatam Mahadevan has identified a filter that he associates with soma usage or some similar substance during the Indus Valley period, about 3300 to 1300 before the Common Era. So I'm also not at all suggesting that the use of the soma or something like it was exclusively an Aryan importation into India either. It seems the soma sacrifice was a synthesis of the Aryan culture, the Indus Valley civilization, and another culture which also knew about the use of these substances in that area. The Indus Valley civilization was located in what is now northwest India and Pakistan. Cannabis may also have been smoked during this period, and of course, cannabis is still smoked by yogis in Nepal, and probably India too. I'm not specifically aware of India. I certainly know that that is well known in Nepal. It also seems likely that the inhabitants of the Indus Valley, who had cultivated cattle for generations, were familiar with psilocybin, which grows in cow dung. The universal veneration of the cow in Indian culture is interesting in this context. The psychological effects of psilocybin are very similar to ayahuasca, the potent visionary medicine of the shamans of the Amazon. And some people actually think soma was ayahuasca as well. It's one of the substances which has been proposed as being soma. Personally, I think that's unlikely, but nonetheless, it has been proposed. The use of entheogens is also documented in the Oxus Valley civilization. That's the other civilization I was referring to, between 2300 and 1700 before the Common Era. These were the ancestors of the Indo-Iranians located to the north of the Indus Valley civilization. This civilization shows evidence of the use of cannabis, poppy pollen, and ephedra in the context of ritual fire worship. Victor Sarianidi regards this as a precursor of the Soma or Haoma cult, and Haoma is the Iranian term for soma, H-A-O-M-A. Strainers or filters like the ones found depicted on Indus Valley seals have also been identified. Soma is associated with the chief of the Vedic pantheon, Indra. Indra drinks it insatiably and is also associated with mushrooms, interestingly. Thus, soma is both the object and the source of the enlightenment of the rishis, the inspired ecstatic vates, or bards. The essence and source of their enlightenment is the soma sacrifice, called the Agnihotra. This sacrifice probably originally referred to the psychological death-rebirth experience, but subsequently became the sacrifice of a soma surrogate as a ritual object. Martin Hogue, in his introduction of his translation of the Aitareya Brahmana Grantha, recognizes the central significance of the soma rite, and I'm quoting, "Such expressions as to make the Brahma or to stir up the Brahma Brahma Jinvati, throw some light on its nature. They show, as in Taittiriya Brahmana Grantha 1.1, that it was regarded as a latent power, like electricity, which was to be stirred up at the time of performance of a ceremony. So there we have the churning of the ocean motif again. The apparatus were sacred vessels or the hymns or chants. And sonic driving is another technique to induce the ecstatic state. So at a certain ceremony, at the morning libation of the Soma feast, the Advaryu and Pratiprashtatra put the two grahas, the Soma cups, together and address them. May ye stir it up for me, quote unquote. The sacrificer wishes by means of the mystical process of the sacrifice to get hold of it, for only then he is sure of obtaining anything he might wish for, unquote. And the anonymous author of Secret Drugs in Buddhism thus describes this rite, again, quoting, using 108 bricks, a hearth was constructed in the shape of a bird, and you'll recognize that number, 108, from Buddhism as well, within which priests would build a fire. An animal, tethered to a post, was beheaded, and the main part of the ritual began. The priests would lay out a leather mat and place upon it 2 circular grinding stones. A certain plant was crushed between these stones with an admixture of milk or water to make an inebriating drink, which was then consumed. As this process allows no time for fermentation, we must infer that Soma, also called Amrita, immortality, was a decoction of a psychoactive plant and not alcohol, unquote. 114 hymns of the 9th book of the Rig Veda are dedicated to the god of Soma. He is also referred to throughout the Vedas. The Yajurveda celebrates Soma as the source of illumination and awakening, and quoting from the Yajurveda, I place thee that hast light, I place thee that makest light, I place thee that findest light, I place thee that shinest, I place thee that burnest, I place thee that flashest, I place thee that art aflame, I place thee that blazest, I place thee that art immortal, I place thee that hast great light, I place thee that awakenest, I place thee that art awake, unquote. Soma is the source of the divine immortality. This mythos reappears in the Hebrew Bible, in which the Elohim, literally gods, plural, cast Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden, lest they eat of the tree of life and live forever like the gods themselves. Remembering, of course, that Soma is the drink of the gods in the Vedic tradition. Soma is also the drink that confers godhead on people, those who consume it. Soma, like the Buddha, is described as a royal bull. It seems safe to say that Indian spirituality in general, and the Vedas in particular, have their specific origin in the psychedelic experience. And yet, there are scholars. I read an entire book recently by a rather academic scholar who was discussing Soma. He managed to write an entire book on Soma without ever acknowledging or even hinting that Soma was actually a psychedelic. So deep is the cultural denial. Okay, let's discuss the ancient tradition. Since the Buddha was certainly a samana, one might therefore ask the question, was the Buddha also a shaman? Is Buddhism shamanic? Since the characteristics of shamanism are well defined, answering this question should not be a hard task. The Buddha himself refers to a forgotten ancient tradition that he himself rediscovered in the current age. This is the Dharma, the truth of things as they are, or the cosmic order. Similarly, the shaman enters the other world to obtain ontic knowledge. The Buddha could not be referring to Brahmanism or even the Vedas, which were well known and which he explicitly rejected, but he may have been referring to something within the Vedas that had been forgotten or hidden, because the Buddha also attacked secrecy, or even to a lost prehistoric civilization. It is clear that during the late Vedic period, the primordial spirituality of the Vedas was replaced by the dogmatic, superstitious, authoritarian, and oppressive regime of the Brahmins, who the Buddha criticizes and even derides frequently. Mircea Eliade, author of the definitive study of shamanism entitled Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy, notes that, quote, a first definition of this complex phenomenon, and perhaps the least hazardous, will be shamanism equals technique of religious ecstasy, unquote. Therefore, the first question we must ask is, did the Buddha teach a technique of ecstasy? The English word ecstasy is derived from Latin ex plus Proto-Indo-European sta, meaning to stand. Thus, ecstasy means to put out of place. In Pali, the English word ecstasy is translated as jhana. This refers, of course, to the four jhanas, which is an essential component of the Buddhist path. This term may also be translated as trance or meditative state, although in the Pali-English dictionary, the Rhys-Davids strongly rejects either of these, especially trance, as a translation of jhana. They were central to the practice of meditation as taught by the Buddha. Practitioners of jhana would retire into a remote, secluded place, including a charnel ground, where they would sit cross-legged and concentrate. A special object that was used as a focus of visualization, called a kasina, often induced this mental concentration. Isolation, hypomotility, concentration, awareness, and visualization are all techniques commonly found amongst practitioners of shamanism. Shamanism is primarily a technique for altering consciousness in order to communicate with the spirit world. By means of this contact, the shaman brings back knowledge and benign power. This includes the therapeutic power to heal the spiritual ills of the people. Ultimately, all ills in this worldview are spiritual. Similarly, when the Buddha achieved the experience of enlightenment, he remained in a deep trance state for an entire week. During this time, his body became physically rigid, and he became impercipient. The Buddha's original purpose was to discover the cure for the primary ill of humanity, dukkha, or existential suffering, or as I've been translating it more recently, angst. Similarly, the shaman brings back cures to heal the sickness of the people. During his enlightenment experience, the Buddha experienced intense visions of Mara that included various hallucinations and culminated in a conversation with the chief of the Brahma realm. The Buddha also stated that devas came to him at night and gave him teachings. The Buddha taught his disciples a wide variety of mental techniques for altering consciousness. These included the cultivation of the mental body. The mental body is a psychic projection of the physical body. In this state, one is able to experience other ontic realms inhabited by spirits and other deva beings. This is all explicitly documented in the Pali Canon. One need not invoke any Mahayana sutras or even tantras. It is, however, interesting to note that the teachings of the Buddha were subsequently merged with native magical and shamanic traditions that were already well established throughout the Himalayas, especially in Tibet. And we do find this aspect of Buddhism most developed in Tibet, but by no means exclusively so. In fact, even Theravada has a tantric form, popularly called Theravada Tantra, or Tantric Theravada. It has a proper Pali name, too, which has slipped my mind. Eliade identifies 8 core beliefs of shamanism as follows. 1. Spirits exist, and they play important roles both in individual lives and in human society. 2. The shaman can communicate with the spirit world. 3. Spirits can be benevolent or malevolent. 4. The shaman can treat sickness caused by malevolent spirits. 5. The shaman can employ trance-inducing techniques to incite visionary ecstasy and go on vision quests. 6. The shaman's spirit can leave the body to enter the supernatural world to search for answers. 7. The shaman evokes animal images as spirit guides, omens, and message bearers. And 8. The shaman can perform other varied forms of divination, scry, throw bones or runes, and sometimes foretell future events. Similarly, the Buddha refers to devas or spiritual beings whose lives intersect our own. These include relatively minor deities such as nature spirits, the great forces of nature, and sublime spiritual beings, far more beautiful, intelligent, longer-lived, and powerful than we are. There are also great spiritual beings that range from indifferent to hostile toward humanity. Humans themselves are reputed to be descended from the radiant devas, who inhabit 3 deva realms next above the Brahma realms, that are in turn the lowest realm of the form world next above our own sensual world. They fly through the air as spherical globes of light, cohabit with us in our oldest cities, influence us mentally, and watch us. Not all devas are either benign or Buddhist. Certain devas, including the aforementioned asuras, actually oppose human progress. The Buddha stated many times that he could communicate with beings of higher worlds and visit them there. Such beings also appeared to him, and he received teachings from them. Buddhism ascribes to the Buddha, and the Buddha ascribes to himself, the discovery of the cure for the essential problem of human suffering. Thus, the Buddha is the ultimate shaman, physician, the ultimate shaman physician. The Buddha taught numerous techniques designed to alter consciousness in the pursuit of spiritual emancipation. The Buddha himself experienced trance for 7 days during his enlightenment experience. Many of the Buddha's techniques correspond to similar essential techniques used by shamans. The Buddha's quest for enlightenment is tantamount to a vision quest. Eliade alludes to the importance of the shamanic crisis. This corresponds exactly to Gautama's bringing himself to the threshold of death before his subsequent enlightenment. In the meditative state, the Buddha's disciples are said to ascend to higher planes of existence. This is done by the cultivation of the mental body. The mental body is a simulacrum of the physical body, projected by the imagination and used to experience other dimensions of consciousness and reality. The Buddha divinized natural forces such as the sun, wind, rain, etc. He referred to them too as devas, much as in Native American spirituality, for example. He regarded animals as not dissimilar from human beings because in terms of rebirth. Thus, he regarded the natural world as intimately interconnected. There is a long Buddhist tradition of reverence for the natural world that seems to go beyond simple compassion for suffering beings. The power of truth, also known as truth magic, is ascribed to the Buddha. This includes many psychic abilities also ascribed to shamans, including remembering past lives. A Buddha cannot lie. Therefore, he himself was used as a tool of divination, and there is at least one example of this in the Pali Canon. The Buddha's reputation for wisdom made him into a kind of oracle. Nevertheless, the Buddha himself denied that he could foretell the future. So, the use of psychedelics in Buddhism. There are those who might object that the Buddha forbade the consumption of drugs, didn't he? We all know the 5th precept. Sura amera yamaja pama datana veramani sikapada imsamadhyami. My rough pronunciation of the Pali, which translates as, I undertake the training rule to abstain from fermented drink that causes heedlessness. This is often extended to drugs, so one often reads in popular expositions of Buddhism, Yuttadhammo comes to mind, that the Buddha also forbade consuming alcohol and non-prescription drugs. In fact, this is so widespread that it's pretty much universal in popular expositions of Buddhism, and I think in many people's minds as well. I have discussed this at some length in my book, Fundamental View, and in other talks that I've given at the Buddha Center and also here. In fact, this passage refers to 3 specific types of alcohol, including one used in Ayurvedic medicine as an anesthetic. hence the qualification, quote, that causes heedlessness, unquote, is probably a direct description of the effects of the drink. In other words, strong alcoholic drinks that cause heedlessness are what are forbidden. This offense is moreover a minor offense in the Vinaya. Often in the Pali Canon it is omitted from the list of precepts referring to not killing, not stealing, not committing sexual transgressions, and not lying. And in fact, the 5 precepts are referred to in the Pali Canon in some places as the 4 precepts. Clearly, this prohibition was never intended to include psychedelics, which the Buddha's cultural tradition clearly regarded as sacrosanct. So there's a little correction to a view that is really widespread in the Buddhist community. The Buddha does not mention the use of psychedelics in his accounts of samana practices, as far as I know. I'm still researching the Pali Canon, looking for references. I haven't found any yet. He did, however, choose to designate the Uposatha, literally eve of the Soma sacrifice, as his Sabbath. This is the familiar moon gathering that monks and also lay people undertake in Buddhist countries. Sometimes the full moon, sometimes the new and full moon, sometimes at the quarters of the moon. The day that the Uposatha actually means eve of the Soma sacrifice, and that was its original Indian origin. The days of the new and full moons are the Buddhist high holy days. The Buddha was also supposed to have been conceived, born, enlightened, and died on the day of the full moon. But why the moon? What's the connection between the moon and Buddhism? In the Rig Veda, the moon is regarded as the cup of Soma. This moon cup is drained by the gods and refilled every month, hence the symbolism. It is possible that the symbolism of the number 7 is also derived from this lunar symbolism, 7 days being the length of a lunar phase in the lunar calendar, a month being, of course, being 28 days, so 4 times 7. Similarly, the 4 phases of the Tantric initiation rite seem to be designed to correspond to the 4 stages of psychedelic intoxication. R. Gordon Wasson has also suggested that the Buddha's final meal of pig's delight, which has always troubled scholars, was in fact a psychedelic mushroom. Wasson speculates that this was in fact a medicine intended to heal the Buddha of his terminal illness, which is why the Buddha said that it is a meal fit only for Buddhas and instructed it to be buried in the ground. It is certainly possible that the Buddha experienced psychedelics. The samanas, like the Buddha, were deliberately recalling a pre-Brahmanic, even pre-Vedic experiential spirituality based on direct knowledge or gnosis. Buddhism does not refer to the Vedic soma as such. Rather, it uses the word amrita, a close synonym. Literally, amrita means deathless or immortal, and you'll recall Buddha refers to the deathless repeatedly throughout the Pali Canon, whereas soma itself means moon. Vajrayana Buddhism uses the sacrament extensively. The consumption of amrita in some form initiates all its important rites. Amrita originally referred to a combination of the fly agaric mushroom and psilocybin. Later it came to refer to a specifically Buddhist mixture of 5 psychoactive herbs. As in Brahmanism, it was also visualized, or an innocuous surrogate was imbibed in place of the real thing, rather as sexual intercourse is imagined in the right-hand path instead of actually being engaged in, as in the left-hand path so-called. And this is, of course, today, in modern tantric rites, you won't find actual psychedelics. What you will find, as in Brahmanism, you'll find this denatured substitute. And you'll also find this in Christianity, of course, as well, with the symbolism of the Eucharist. During the fire ritual, while intoning mantras, the Brahmins ground the soma plant between 2 stones. Mixing the resulting mash with water or milk, they used the wool of a sheep to filter the mixture, offered a small amount to the gods by pouring it into the flames, and then consumed the remainder. It is clear that the original purpose of this ritual was to induce a psychedelic vision of the mandala, or mandala, culminating in an actual experience of, and ultimately, union with its deity. This ritual is now rarely performed. When it is performed, the soma that is consumed is no longer psychoactive. Today, barley beers are substituted for amrita in Tibet, assuming, of course, that the Chinese authorities even still allow it to be practiced. Thus, a Buddhist soma has suffered the same fate as Vedic soma. Altered states of consciousness are still cultivated, however, the prime example being the Nechung oracle, the state oracle of Tibet, who is possessed by Dorji Drakten. In this state, he advises the Dalai Lama. Dorji Drakten is the chief minister of Gyalpo Pehar, and Gyalpo Pehar is the chief of the realm of the four great kings. This refers to the Deva realm next above our own, associated with the slopes of Mount Sumeru, the symbolic projection of the earth plane, or of the vertical axis of the earth plane, to be more specific. I've discussed this symbolism at some length in my talk, Near-Earth Realms, Fallen Angels, and Human Beings in Buddhist Cosmology. Tantric initiates are permitted to attend the Gana Chakra. This refers to a tantric feast performed twice a month, just prior to the new and full moons. Traditionally, these were held in cemeteries and cremation grounds. Male and female celebrants sit in a circle, singing, chanting, and uttering prophecies, while eating meat and drinking the fivefold amrita. There was also dancing, strangely similar to the European traditions concerning the witches' covens. This amrita was symbolically said to consist of urine, feces, brains, blood, and semen. In my discussion of Soma, I mentioned the churning of the world ocean by the Devas and Asuras, who together distill out the sacred Soma. The Tibetans have another version of this myth derived from Shaivite sources. In this myth, Amrita is stated to be the antidote to Halahala. Halahala is a demonic poison that results in death, perhaps a metaphor for death itself, as Amrita is a metaphor for deathlessness, a term that the Buddha uses throughout the Pali Canon as a synonym for emancipation. After a series of events that I will not describe in detail, it results that the Amrita appears all over the earth in the form of plant medicines. These plant medicines come from the demon blood of Rahu, the serpent god associated with the lunar eclipse. Interestingly, this is also the name that the Buddha gives his son. In the Pali Canon, Rahu attacks the sun and the moon, but is compelled to release them by their intoning of a mantra. And you can look at the Chandima and the Surya Suttas in the Samyutta Nikaya of the Pali Canon. In the Tibetan tradition, Padmasambhav subjugated Rahu. The persistent association of Soma Amrita with the serpent, suggestive of the Hebrew story of Genesis aforementioned, is also interesting in view of the universal association of the serpent with Kundalini, or chthonic energy. Soma Amrita is also associated with the demonic and the telluric. It is also noteworthy that the origin of the terrestrial Amrita is the sky, which accords with Terence McKenna's thesis that the origin of psilocybin is extraterrestrial. There are explicit references in the Tibetan literature to the use of plant medicines as a legitimate mode of spiritual practice. For example, the Golden Rosary of Tara refers to a farmer who took Tara as his meditation deity. Quote, "When he dug in the earth and cried, 'Pu, pu,' that is, hiss, hiss, the gate of Patala, the subterranean world, itself opened. Entering the place of the Nagas, the serpent deities, he drank the Amrita he found there. Thus he became like a rainbow body." Unquote. The attainment of the rainbow body, or body of light, is, of course, the ultimate accomplishment of Dzogchen, corresponding to the creation of a mental body referred to in the Pali Canon. Okay, so let's conclude. In this talk, I've addressed 5 topics in relation to the question, was the Buddha a shaman? Namely, shamanism, Samanism, Soma, the ancient tradition, and psychedelics in Buddhism. I've shown that shamanism is the primordial experiential spiritual tradition of humanity that therefore underlies all human spirituality, including, therefore, the Dharma. I've compared shamanism with Shamanism, the proto-Shaivite yogic cult that the Buddha is said to have practiced for 6 years prior to his enlightenment. I have shown that although the Buddha repudiated certain aspects of Shamanism, specifically extreme mortification of the body, he was also influenced by it and continued to emphasize samana practices in his post-enlightenment teaching. This included meditating in charnel grounds and meditating on death. I've also compared the archetypal pattern of the shaman with the life and teachings of the Buddha, and shown consistent, profound, and pervasive parallels between the two. I've discussed the Vedic sacrament of Soma and its Buddhist analog, Amrita, in the context of the Pali Canon as well as the later Buddhist cult of Vajrayana. Although I have found no conclusive evidence that the Buddha recommended the use of psychedelics, and I'd like to underlie that in view of the critique of this talk posted in Reddit, I have found no conclusive evidence that the Buddha recommended the use of psychedelics, and I make no such claim. It seems unlikely that he did not know about them, entrenched as they are in Indian culture. As a samana, it is at least possible that he experienced them. I continue to research the Pali Canon for evidence that this might be the case. However, insofar as shamanism is concerned, and you will recall that was the original question, the correspondences between the life and teachings of the Buddha and the prototypical cult of shamanism are too fundamental and too pervasive to deny that the Buddha does in fact conform to the shamanic pattern. The Buddha was indeed a shaman. Okay, that concludes my talk. Thank you very much for your attention. Before we proceed with the dedication of merit, whereby we dedicate the merit of this talk to all beings, does anyone have any questions or comments or discussion they would like to have concerning anything we've been talking about? And I will also remind you that I do have this talk on note card. If you would like a copy of the note card, please feel free to IM me after the talk, and I'll be happy to send a copy to you. And it's also available on my blog, located at www.palisudas.com, which I'll just put in the chat before I read the question that someone has posted that I see popping up on my screen. There it is, palisudas.com. So, Paloma Porta says, the idea or expectation of getting spiritual clarity with a drug, loaded word, but okay, then manifests the clarity and also the various substances found in the brain, and indeed also the idea of having a brain manifests the brain. The brain chemicals are not the cause of the drug's effect. It's all smoke and mirrors. The hologram of the real world plays out as it follows the ideas or direction found in consciousness. For example, shamans don't actually leave their body. Consciousness does not move. They just change their view or reality they see to look like they are out of the body. Okay, fine. I have no problem with that. It's a psychological experience. It's a spiritual experience. Yes, their body doesn't fly away. And this actually may be the explanation of some of the psychic powers that are described in the Pali Canon, as I've discussed in previous talks, which include things like the projection of a mental body, levitation, traveling through the universe, touching the sun and the moon, etc. Within the context of realism, this becomes difficult to interpret, but in the context of the psychedelic experience, it becomes, spiritual ecstasy, not just psychedelic, but also the experience of ecstasy. These experiences become comprehensible. However, no truth can be written. It all depends how one looks at it. Nothing exists, everything exists, individual spiritual beings exist, don't exist. Bad habits or off-path activities then are just agreed upon as bad for us If one can disagree with a teaching with certainty, one can do as one wishes. Okay, well, I don't see a question there, so I won't, there's nothing for me to answer. I do take issue with the suggestion that because consciousness, because the brain is a structure of consciousness, therefore the brain does not exist. I do take issue with that. I certainly agree with the idea that consciousness is the ultimate reality, but consciousness, of course, constructs reality. And in the process of constructing reality, it constructs reality. And therefore, the brain does exist as a function of consciousness. That's really the only point in there that I really take issue with. Nothing else in that I disagree with. Anything else? Yes, and also just after Vesak. Vesak was May, I believe, May 3 and 4. Which I'm preparing my book. Some of you may be aware that I'm giving a series of talks in the Digha Nikaya at the Buddha Center. And we're coming to the end. There's only half a dozen or so talks left, and I started to typeset my book, Conversations with the Buddha, a Reader's Guide to the Digha Nikaya, and I wrote the preface to the book over Vesak. So that will be available in a couple of months, probably. Any other questions, comments, or discussion before we conclude? Thank you very much, Jai Bop. Any other questions, comments, or discussion before we conclude with the dedication of merit? Okay, it seems not. So let's conclude with dedication of merit. Whatever understanding, whatever positive force has come from this, may it go deeper and deeper and act as a cause to reach enlightenment for the benefit of all. Thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss Dharma. It is my pleasure and privilege, as always. Until I will return next Tuesday at 2 o'clock, 2 p.m., Second Life time, to give another of my talks. And I also do give talks every Sunday at 2 o'clock, at 3, I've forgotten what time it is. I think 2 o'clock at the Buddha Center every Sunday as well. 4 o'clock here, pardon me, I got my times mixed up. 4 o'clock at the Chitta Bhavana Ashram on Tuesdays, 2 o'clock at Buddha Center on Sundays. So thank you very much. Until next time, Namaskar.